took up entire rooms. I know, I had to look at pictures myself just to believe it. But computers in those days, they could only run one program at a time. So if you were lucky enough even to be able to have access to a computer, you had to wait in line. You had to wait your turn just to get the computer program to run the computer to run the one program that you needed it to do. Back then, computers ran on cardboard punch cards. And so you would take these cardboard punch cards and punch holes in them and sort them in a specific way to get the computer to run the program that you needed it to do. And some of these programs needed hundreds, sometimes thousands of different cards just to run one program. And so you would take your cards and you would punch holes in them in a specific way, sort them in a specific way, and you would give them to the computer operator. And when it came your turn, he would use your cards to run the computer program. If you had just a couple cards out of place, your whole program would be messed up. You had to go back, sort through them, find the mistake, and give it back to the computer operator, wait your turn again, and then it could finally run your program. It was very tedious. It was very hard to do, and access to computers back then was very hard to get, as it was. And then if you did have access, they were very difficult to use. But in 1965, a computer called a teletype machine was invented, and it was able to run hundreds of programs at the same time. And so there was no more waiting in line. There was no more having to give your cards to an operator. Hundreds of people could run programs to the computer all at the same time. But those types of computers, they were really expensive. And again, there was only a few available throughout the entire country. So they were very hard to access. Bill Joy was born in 1954. At the very dawn of the computing age. He was born in the suburbs of Detroit, and in 1971 he enrolled at the University of Michigan in their engineering program. That same year, the University of Michigan purchased a teletype computer. They built an entire computer center around this computer so that their students could have access to this computer. And so when Bill Joy enrolled at the University of Michigan in 1971 as a freshman, he was introduced to this computer center. And he absolutely fell in love with computers. He would spend 8 to 10 hours a day in the computer center learning about computer programming. One summer he got an internship with one of the computer science professors so that he could continue to learn more and more about computers. And so by the time he graduated, he had 4 years of experience working with computers and computer programming that very few people across the country were able to get. Because the University of Michigan had one of these machines that was one of only a handful of computers across the entire country. And so Bill Joy enrolled in a graduate program at the University of California, Berkeley, to study computer programming. He actually purchased a computer for his own home, which is extremely rare in those days, and he was able to do computer programming night and day. There were nights he stayed into the wee hours of the morning and fell asleep at his keyboard because all he did was work on computers and learn computer programming. And so by the time he was getting his PhD in computer science, Bill Joy had logged more hours on a computer than virtually anyone else had ever logged before. And he was writing his own programming algorithms that completely amazed his professors. He would go on to work for AT&T, and he would write a lot of the software that we use still today in a lot of our operating systems on our computers. The software programming that we use to access the internet, Bill Joy wrote most of it. Bill Joy in Silicon Valley is spoken of with the same kind of awe as Bill Gates or Steve Jobs. He's often called the Edison of the internet. Now, you may be a little bit more familiar with Bill Gates' story. He was born in Seattle. He was born to a rich family. His parents enrolled him at a private school called Lakeside. There was this booster club that would raise money for the school every year. And one year, they raised enough money to buy a teletype computer for this private school. And so when Bill Gates was in 8th grade in 1968, he was able to have access to a computer that virtually no one else in the entire country had access to. And so he joined this computer club, and he spent lots and lots of hours learning about computer programming. The University of Washington, which was nearby, also purchased one of these computers. And Bill Gates was actually able to earn independent study credit at his high school by doing computer programming at the University of Washington. And so when Bill Gates enrolled at Harvard, he had already logged 5 years of computer programming experience when virtually no one else had access to this type of computer. You may be also familiar with Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs was born just in the suburbs of San Francisco in a little town called Mountain View. It's the epicenter of Silicon Valley. In his neighborhood were engineers and computer scientists that worked at Hewlett-Packard. He would go in the evenings to seminars taught by these engineers and computer scientists at the age of 13. He would go to local flea markets and buy spare parts and build his own machines. He even wrote a letter to Bill Hewlett himself asking for spare parts. And he not only received those parts, he also landed himself a summer job. So just because of where Steve Jobs lived, he had access to computers, to computer parts, and computer scientists that virtually no one else had that same access to. All three of these guys, Bill Joy, Bill Gates, and Steve Jobs, because of where they lived, because of where they went to school, just because of the time period in which they were born, they were able to leverage those things to find massive success. Those three guys were born at the absolute perfect time to find success in the computing field. All three of them were born in the mid-50s. And so by 1975, they were all in their early 20s. What happened in 1975? Well, in January of 1975, on the cover of Popular Electronics, the magazine that every computer nerd had a subscription to, on the cover was the Altair 8800. It was featured on the cover. The Altair 8800 was the world's first personal computer. Before this came out, computers filled up whole rooms. Okay, it was virtually unheard of for a single person to own their own computer. They were huge, they were expensive. How could anyone ever own one themselves? Well, in 1975, the concept of the personal computer came into existence. Someone born 3 to 5 years before the mid-50s, the early 50s, and they went to school to learn computer science. By 1975, they would have already graduated. They would have already got a full-time job, probably working for IBM or Hewlett-Packard. They would have had a wife and kids and responsibility. They would have been born just a little bit too old to mess around with personal computers. Their full-time job was working with these big, massive computers. They didn't have time to worry about messing with personal computers in their garage. Someone that was born a few years after the mid-50s, in the late 50s, early 60s, was too young to be able to capitalize on this specific time. But these three guys, Bill Joy, Bill Gates, and Steve Jobs, were born at just the right time to be in their early 20s in 1975, when they had time to mess around with personal computers and software and computer programming in their garage. And they were able to leverage that specific time to equal massive success. You can call it luck, you can call it fate. I like to call it God's providence. There are all kinds of times in our life, places that we happen to be, things that we have learned before that become useful later. that we can leverage to have success. Our gifts, our abilities, our personality, our family, the family we were born into, our geographical location. We have all been placed and given things that are completely out of our control that make us completely unique and able to serve God in a completely unique way. What those things are, the circumstances that you find yourself in, they don't matter. How you use those resources is ultimately what matters. If you have your Bibles today, we'll be looking at a passage from Matthew chapter 25. If you don't have a Bible, the words will be on the screen. The version that I use is a little bit different than what you might have. But in Matthew chapter 24, the chapter right before what we're going to look at today, is it's called the Olivet Discourse. It's this discourse that Jesus gave on the Mount of Olives. That's why it's called the Olivet Discourse. And in this discourse, he tells his disciples what it's going to be like when he comes back for the second time. So he describes this in detail. And so in chapter 25, right after he talks about what it's going to be like in his second coming, he talks about what he expects his disciples to be doing in between the time of his first coming and in between his second coming. And so the very first thing that he talks about, he tells the parable of the 10 virgins. Some of your versions might say the parable of the 10 girls. And in this parable, Jesus describes how 5 of the girls were ready for the groom to return and 5 of the girls were not. And in telling this story, he's saying he expects his disciples to be ready for his second return. But in the meantime, starting in verse 14, he describes what they should be doing while they are getting ready. Starting in verse 14, he tells the parable of the talents. A talent was originally a unit of measurement, but it was so often used to measure currency that it just became a measure of currency. So some of your versions might say the parable of the money, the parable of the bags of gold, different things like that. But a talent is just a unit of currency. Okay, we aren't told exactly how much currency, but it's just a general word for currency. Okay? So beginning in verse 14 of chapter 25, Jesus tells this story. At that time, God's kingdom will also be like a man leaving home to travel to another place for a visit. Before he left, he talked with his servants. He told his servants to take care of his things while he was gone. He decided how much each servant would be able to care for. The man gave one servant 5 bags of money. He gave another servant 2 bags, and he gave a third servant 1 bag. The servant who got 5 bags went quickly to invest the money, and those 5 bags earned 5 more. It was the same with the servant who had 2 bags. That servant invested the money and earned 2 more. But the servant who got 1 bag of money, he went away and dug a hole in the ground, and then he hid his master's money in the hole. After a long time, the master came home. He asked the servants what they did with his money. The servant who got 5 bags brought that amount and 5 more bags to the master. The servant said, "Master, you trusted me to care for 5 bags of money, so I used them to earn 5 more." The master answered, "You did right. You are a good servant who can be trusted. You did well with that small amount of money, so I will let you care for much greater things. Come and share my happiness with me." Then the servant who got 2 bags of money, he came to the master. The servant said, "Master, you gave me 2 bags of money to care for, so I used your 2 bags to earn 2 more." The master answered, "You did right. You are a good servant who can be trusted. You did well with a small amount of money, so I will let you care for much greater things. Come and share my happiness with me." Then the servant who got 1 bag of money, he came to the master. And the servant said, "Master, I knew you were a very hard man. You harvest what you did not plant, and you gather crops where you did not put any seed. So I was afraid. I went and hid your money in the ground. Here is the 1 bag of money that you gave me." The master answered, "You are a bad and lazy servant. You say you knew that I harvest where I did not plant, and that I gather crops where I did not put any seed? Well, so you should have put my money in the bank. Then when I came home, I would get my money back, and I would also get the interest that money earned. So the master told his servants, take the 1 bag of money from that servant and give it to the servant who has 10 bags. Listen to this. Everyone who uses what they have will get more. They will have much more than they need. But people who do not use what they have will have everything taken away from them. Then the master said, throw that useless servant outside into the darkness where people will cry and grind their teeth with pain. In his book Outliers, Malcolm Gladwell lists the 75 richest people to ever live. So adjusting for inflation relative to the time period in which these people lived, Malcolm Gladwell used research going all the way back to Cleopatra to determine the 75 richest people to ever live. 60% of that list, of the 75 richest people, 45 of them were born in America. Simply because of the country in which they live, there were 45 people that became the richest people to ever live. And what's even crazier is that 14 of those people were born in a 9-year time period in the 1830s. 14 people who were born in the 1830s were in their mid-30s right after the Civil War, during the Reconstruction period, during the height of the railroad industry, and when Wall Street was established. Now, these 14 people were able to capitalize on that specific time period, utilizing their entrepreneurial ingenuity. That's a mouthful right there. Their entrepreneurial ingenuity to have massive success. Simply because of the circumstances that they found themselves in, they were able to leverage the resources that they were given to find success. The master in this story, he gave 3 servants 3 different amounts of money. He gave one 5 units of money. He gave another 2 units of money. He gave a third 1 unit of money. They didn't ask the master for a certain amount of money. They didn't even ask for the money at all. Right? It was simply just given to them. By no faults, nothing that they did to earn it. It was simply just given to them. They had no control over what they were given. And the only reason that it tells us why the master gave a certain amount to each servant was because the master simply decided what each servant would be able to care for. But regardless of what was given to them, the first 2 servants doubled what they had been given. And the third servant buried what he was given into the ground. He tried to rationalize his actions by calling his master harsh and unreasonable, which wasn't true. But the third servant looked at what he was given, and he compared it to what was given to the other 2 servants. He looked at what he had been given, and he said, why would I only get 1 unit of money when those guys got more? And the more he thought about this, the more he became bitter. The more he grew in despair. And the more he had a feeling of uselessness. Until the point when he said to himself, what am I going to do with this piddly amount of money? I'm not going to have any success. I'm not going to be able to do anything with it. Those guys have more. They have more opportunity. I'm just going to bury it in the ground and hope I don't lose it. How often do we do what the third servant did? We look at what we have been given and we compare it to someone else. We grow bitter. We develop a sense of despair, a sense of uselessness. How often do we think that we have nothing to offer because we haven't been given what someone else has been given? We say things like, oh, I grew up on the wrong end of town. Or I was born into the wrong family. I don't make the kind of money they make. What can I do? What do I have to offer? I don't have the same skills that someone else has. I don't have the same opportunities that someone else has had. The doors that opened for them haven't opened for me. So what can I do? But what about the first two servants? The first servant was given 5 units of money. 2.5 times what the second servant was given, and 5 times what the third servant was given. He didn't rub it in their face. He didn't brag about it. He didn't throw a party to celebrate how rich he had become. He leveraged what he had been given to produce a result for his master. He didn't just sit idly by and think about how good he had it. He used what he had been given to serve his master. The second servant could have easily done what the third servant did. He could have looked at what the first servant had received and thought to himself, oh, I only got 2 units of money, and that guy got 5. What am I going to do with this? I can't have the same success that he had, that he's going to have. He could have grown bitter. He could have whined and complained about his master. But that's not what he did. He invested what he had been given. He leveraged his resources to produce a result for his master. And look what the master said to both servants, the first servant and the second servant. To both of them, he said, "You did right. You are a good servant who can be trusted. You did well with that small amount of money, so I will let you care for much greater things. Come and share my happiness with me." The first servant produced 2.5 times what the second servant produced, but they both received the same reward. What you are given doesn't matter. And what you produce ultimately doesn't even matter. The thing that matters is how you use what you have been given to serve God. How you leverage your resources to serve your master. Every single person here is unique. Every single person here has a unique set of resources. Your talents, your abilities, your life experience, your work experience, your family background, where you live, where you come from. They all combine to make you who you are, and they all place you in a place to do something unique that no one else can. You are who you are because God made you that way. You have the talents and abilities that you have because God has given them to you. You've had the life experience and the work experience because God opened those doors for you. You were born in this particular time, in this particular place, to do something to serve God. It doesn't matter what you've been given. It matters how you use them. There were a lot of people born in the mid-50s. There were a lot of people that went to the University of Michigan in the 1970s. There was a lot of people that went to Lakeside when Bill Gates was there. There was a lot of people that lived in San Francisco when Steve Jobs was living there. But only 3 of them leveraged those resources to have success. There was a lot of people born in the 1830s, but there was only 14 of them that leveraged that time period for success. We all have a unique opportunity to leverage the resources that God has given us to serve Him. God has given each one of us a unique opportunity to produce results for His kingdom. And nobody else can do it but you. If the master wanted the first servant to do everything, he would have just taken his 8 talents, his 8 units of money, and just given them to the first servant. But that's not what he did. He gave some to the first servant, some to the second servant, and some to the first servant. God gives gifts to everyone. And it doesn't matter what you've been given. It doesn't matter how much you've been given. You can leverage what you've been given to serve Him. What can you do with what you've been given? How can you leverage your talents and abilities to serve Him? What circumstances has God placed you in? What opportunities has God provided for you that you can use to serve Him? What people has God put in your life that you can share the gospel with? So many times we look at what God has given to us, and we see it as a disadvantage because we compare it with someone who has more. Or we look at the thing that has the experience that we've had in our life, and we look at it as a disadvantage because someone else didn't have to go through what we had to go through. Things like battling cancer, losing a loved one, losing a job. There are lots and lots of things that happen in your life that you can look at as a disadvantage, or you can look at them as an opportunity. If you've had to battle cancer yourself, there's someone out there that is also battling cancer that needs the hope of Christ. If you've lost a job, there's someone out there that also lost a job that needs your help. There's all kinds of different ways that we can leverage the resources that God has given us to serve Him, to serve in His church, to serve in the community, to love people in your neighborhood, to serve people across the world. God has created you uniquely. He has put you in a position that is completely unique so that you can leverage those resources for His kingdom. It doesn't matter what you've been given. It doesn't matter how much you've been given. It only matters how you use what you have been given. Let's pray. Lord, thank you so much for the gifts that you give us. Thank you so much for loving us and caring about us enough to give us exactly what we need. Knowing exactly how much to give us, what to give us, so that we can care for that. Lord, help us not to look at what we've been given as a disadvantage. Help us to see them as opportunities. Help us to leverage what you have given us to produce results for your kingdom. Thank you so much for serving us in the way that you did by dying for us on the cross. Leveraging your resources to save us. It's in your name I pray.